In Jeremiah's day, the prophet Jeremiah, the nation of Judah, the city of Jerusalem were very wicked and corrupt, involving themselves in many, many different kinds of sins. And I'd like us to open up to begin with this morning to Jeremiah chapter 6. Jeremiah chapter 6. And we read here, there are many verses we could read, but let's read about this wicked city of Jerusalem and how they're warned by the prophet that destruction is near. Jeremiah 6 verse 6, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, cut down her trees, cast up a siege against Jerusalem. This is the city to be punished, in whose midst there is only oppression." So there was the warning from the prophet against Jerusalem. Siege would come because this is a wicked city and only oppression can be found in its midst. And God, through his prophets like Jeremiah, of course, warned the people many, many times to change their ways and to leave sin behind. Again, out of many verses we could have a look at, let's skip down to verse 8. "Be warned, O Jerusalem, or I shall be alienated from you and make you a desolation, a land not inhabited." They were wicked, they needed a change. The danger was on the horizon in the form of the Babylonians coming to destroy Jerusalem. They were wicked, they needed a change, and they were being warned by God. But in this chapter, God himself gives a magnificent solution to their problem. And we're not going to read the whole chapter today, but let's skip down to verse 16. Let's have a look at this magnificent solution that the Lord himself comes up with. Verse 16, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the ways and see and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." This is like a diamond in the rough, isn't it? This sublime solution that the Lord himself offers Judah in their rebellion and Jerusalem. And so I've put that up here on the board for us all to see this morning. This is going to be the centrepiece of the talk this morning. The people had a choice to make. They had to stand still. Which way am I going to go? Am I going to keep going in the way of sin? Or am I going to ask for the ancient paths, for the old ways? And not just ask for them, but walk in them. And so I've entitled the lesson this morning, and you can see it comes from that passage, "Ask for and walk in the ancient paths." Not just ask what the ancient paths are, but also walk, follow the ancient paths once you are aware of what they are. Now, just before we start, I'm wondering if you're a bit like me. Don't you hate it when you see the introduction of a good show on TV or a good movie? Not that there are many good shows on TV or movies these days, but when you see the start of a good movie or a good show where it's just packed with action and you're really getting into it and you're really enjoying this show, and then all of a sudden it stops and it says a few days earlier or months ago, and then it slowly builds up the story before you get back into the action again. Well, I hope you don't hate that too much, because that's what I'm going to do this morning. We're going to go back a little bit before the time of Jeremiah and slowly get closer to the time of Jeremiah. And so what I'd like us to think about is this here. I've got a timeline here, and I can't fit it all on the overhead here, but basically I want us to think about the timeline here. We're going to go back as far as Moses, Mount Sinai, where the giving of the law came. Moses, about 1450 BC, let's say, approximately. And we're going to go down this timeline, and we're going to come across a few kings of Judah, Hezekiah and Josiah. We're going to have a look at a couple of prophets, Jeremiah and Malachi, who all lived before the time of Jesus dying on the cross. And then the timeline extends. I haven't drawn it to scale, of course, but you can see up this end a bit of a break in the timeline here, but up here are we in 2024. So let's begin by thinking of this timeline, and in particular thinking about Hezekiah, because Hezekiah was one who was very keen to ask for the ancient paths and to walk in them. And so let's turn in our Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 18. 2 Kings chapter 18. Now, Hezekiah lived about reigned about 715 to 686 BC. You could see it's about 700 or 800 years after the time of Moses, about 700 years before the time of Jesus. And very sadly, in Judah at this time, there were many sins being committed, much like it was in the time of Jeremiah that we saw earlier on. So let's read in 2 Kings 18 verse 1. Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea the son of Elah, the king of Israel, that Hezekiah the son of Ahaz, the king of Judah, became king. Now we need to remember that Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, was a very wicked king, and there was much evil going on in Judah. Verse 2, he was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places, he broke down the sacred pillars, he cut down the Asherah. He also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the sons of Israel had burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. For he clung to the Lord. He did not depart from following him. Now, notice this very carefully. But he kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. Do you get that there? Here's Hezekiah. He reforms the evil that his father had involved the kingdom in. He reforms it by doing what? By asking for the ancient paths and walking in them. He goes all the way back many hundreds of years to the time of Moses and says, what's the law of Moses? What's that covenant that God made with us as his people? He went all the way back, you see, to the time of Moses. And he was able to get rid of the idolatry and reform the nation, and much good was done under his reign. Again, though that law of Moses was by this time almost 800 years old, still he went back to it and he asked for the ancient path so that he might walk in it. Just before we leave Hezekiah, if you go over to 2 Kings 18, you might remember just before Hezekiah came to rule, just a few years before, the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC was taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And it's interesting to read why they were taken into captivity. 2 Kings 18, verses 11 and 12. The king of Assyria carried Israel away into exile to Assyria, and he put them in Halah and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, in the cities of the Medes. Now why? Because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, they would neither listen nor do it. They not only didn't listen, but they didn't do it. And so that northern kingdom, just before the time of Hezekiah, was taken into captivity because they didn't ask for the ancient paths. They didn't go back to the law of Moses that was about 800 years old or 700 years old at that time. They didn't go back and ask for that ancient path and walk by it. Well, let's keep going. It's only a few years until the reign of Josiah. He was also a king over Judah. But with Josiah, very sadly, the nation after Hezekiah had fallen back into their evil ways with idolatry and so on. So along comes Josiah, and he's a good king. He tries to reform things as well, just as Hezekiah did. So almost 100 years later, I guess it is, let's turn to 2 Kings 23. And let's see what he does. In 2 Kings 23, let's read a little of his reign in verses 24 and 25. Verse 24, moreover Josiah removed the mediums and the spiritists and the teraphim and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might confirm the words of the law which were written in the book that Hezekiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might. Now notice this again. According to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So you see, Josiah was a bit like Hezekiah. He didn't worry that the law was hundreds and hundreds of years old. He asked for the ancient paths, you see. And not only did he ask for them, he walked in them. He went all the way back to the law of Moses to go and to follow the truth, to get rid of the idols, to overcome the evil that was in the land. And these two kings, good kings, they didn't look at the lands around them, at what the lands around them were doing and the gods that they were worshipping, anything like that. They didn't do it. They went back to the ancient paths and they walked in them, the law of Moses that God had made with his people. And so that's a sort of introduction now to the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, who prophesied about 626 to 585 BC, sort of overlapped a bit with the reign of Josiah, went past the reign of Josiah. But along comes Jeremiah, and as we've seen, he does the same thing. He tells the people, ask for the ancient paths and walk in them. Go back to the time of Moses, you see, into the law and start walking in the commandments that God has given you. And it's interesting that here, where in the New American Standard we've got stand by the way and see. I'll put that on a bit further here. Stand by the ways and see. The New International Version has got the crossroads, which is interesting, isn't it? You've come to a crossroad, you see. Which way are you going to go on this crossroad? Stand. Stand. Don't just keep going the way you're going. Stop for a minute. And you've got to make a choice to make. What choice are you going to make? You've got to ask for the ancient paths, advises Jeremiah, the old ways, the ways of Moses. And not only do you ask for them, but you walk in them. You've got to do them. No good just to know what the old ways are. You've got to walk in them. And this is the advice that Jeremiah gave his people. Stand, stop the way you're going, select, choose which path you're going to go, walk, go down that path, the way of the ancient teachings of Moses. And you see, people like Jeremiah, and we'll see in a moment Malachi and Josiah and Hezekiah, they weren't innovators, were they? They didn't come along and say, oh, well, let's do this now, something new or something different. They weren't innovators. They were people that took others back to the old law, to the ancient ways, and said, let's go back to them and follow them. Back in Jeremiah chapter 6, let's turn there. In Jeremiah chapter 6, as we continue down the passage, verse 19. Very sad commentary on the people in the time of Jeremiah. Hear, O earth, behold, I am bringing disaster on this people, the fruit of their plans, because they have not listened to my words, and as for my law, they have rejected it also. They hadn't listened to God's words, they weren't listening to the prophets that God had sent, and as for my law, they'd rejected that as well. They refused to go back to the ways of old. And we know that eventually the Babylonians did come in and Jerusalem was destroyed. A little bit further over, Jeremiah chapter 18. In Jeremiah chapter 18, verse 15. Have a look at these very sad words again. Jeremiah 18, verse 15, my people have forgotten me. They burn incense to worthless gods. They've gone back into idolatry again, you see. And they have stumbled from their ways. Notice this, from the ancient paths. They've forgotten, you see, the ancient paths. They've forgotten the law of Moses that was 700 or 800 years old by that stage. They'd forgotten the ancient paths to walk in bypaths, not on a highway, to make their land a desolation, an object of perpetual hissing. Everyone who passes by it will be astonished and shake his head. You see, the people said, I know what you're saying, Jeremiah. Go back to the ancient ways and walk in it. But notice the rest of verse 16, but they said, we will not walk in it. They refused to go back. They refused to leave off all the idolatry and so on that they were committing themselves with, and they refused to go back and follow the old law that had been given centuries and centuries beforehand. And so the nation fell and they were taken into captivity. About 70 years after They returned from captivity and resettled the land again. A new generation, of course, came in and resettled the land. And it was a little time after this that a fellow that returned, a fellow called Nehemiah, said these words. Let's turn to the book of Nehemiah. And it's interesting to note, I think, what Nehemiah says after they returned from captivity. Again, we're not going to read the whole context here. You can read the surrounding verses in your own time. But let's notice here in Nehemiah 1 verse 7, Nehemiah says, "We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances," notice this again, "which you commanded your servant Moses." So when the people, even when they came back from captivity, people like Nehemiah acknowledged that the reason they went into captivity to start with was because they didn't go back to the ancient ways and follow the ancient ways. So even after God had punished them, they acknowledged that. And I don't want to do this theme to death, but I did think it might be nice to have a look at Malachi before we leave this part of the talk this morning. Have you ever wondered, in the Bibles that we've got, what the very last commandment of the very last book of the Bible is? Have you ever wondered about that? What's the very last commandment of the very last chapter or the very last book of the Old Testaments as we have them in our Bible? What do you think it is? Well, let's turn to Malachi. The book of Malachi is the last book in our Bibles as we have them today. And have a look at the last commandment. Now, I don't want you to look at verses 5 and 6 of Malachi 4 because that's the promise about the coming of John the Baptist. That's not a commandment, that's a promise about what would happen in the future. But do you pick up the last commandment? Look at verse 4, Malachi 4 verse 4. "Remember the law of Moses, my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel." I mean, is it sinking in this morning? Are we getting the message that even right at the end, before the 400 years gap, before the coming of John the Baptist and so on, the last word that they had, as far as we've got in our Bibles today, was remember the law of Moses. Go back, you see. What Malachi is about 440 BC, let's say, approximately around there. Law of Moses about 1450 BC. Go back 1,000 years. That's how the people remember the last text of the Old Testament. In this 400 years gap, what do you need to remember? Go back to the law of Moses. Ask for the ancient path. I mean, the message can't be any clearer, can it? And I've hammered it this morning for one very good reason. And that reason is that I want us to think about us today. What are we going to do today? This principle still applies. What are we going to do? Are we going to go back to the ancient paths or not? Or are we just going to go the way that we feel like going and the way that we so choose? We need to say, of course, this morning that so far as we are concerned, we are no longer under the law of Moses. In Hebrews chapter 7 verse 12, let's turn there. In Hebrews chapter 7 verse 12, we're told here that when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes place a change of law also. Now the priesthood has changed. Jesus has come and has become our high priest. He's of the tribe of Judah, not of the tribe of Levi, where the priests used to come from. So the priesthood has been changed, which means the law has also been changed as well. We're no longer under the law of Moses. So when we think about this principle of going back to the ancient ways, we don't go back to Moses. We don't keep the 10 Commandments today as such. We don't observe the Sabbath today as such. 9 of the 10 Commandments are repeated by Jesus under the new covenant, of course, but we don't go back there. We go back to the teachings of Jesus these days. To see that, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. The law has changed, and what did Paul write in 1 Corinthians chapter 9? 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let's read from verse 20. Paul says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, though not myself being under the law, Now, Paul tried to save as many people as he could with the gospel, and sometimes it required him to make allowances for them. He didn't sin, he didn't compromise the gospel, of course, but to the Jew he became like a Jew. But notice he emphasises here that he wasn't himself under the law. He wasn't under the law of Moses when he tried to convert the Jews. But let's read on. So that I might win those who are under the law. Verse 21, to those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. So Paul makes it very clear. He wasn't under the law of Moses, but he was under the law of Christ. And that's the law that we are all under today if we are Christians. We are under this law of Christ. This changing of the law that took place when the changing of the priesthood took place as well. And so today, you see, if we want to ask the same question, if we want to follow this principle of asking for the ancient paths, where do we go? We don't go back to Moses. We go all the way back to the time of Jesus and the apostles. Remember, Jesus promised that his apostles would be guided into all the truth, John 16 verse 13. The church that Jesus built was founded on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, New Testament prophets. We go back to them because the faith was once for all delivered in that first century, Jude 3. And the early Christians devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, Acts 2 verse 42. That's our standard for today, you see. If we're going to follow this principle about going back to the ancient paths, then we need to go back to that first century and live under this law of Christ. And the reason I say that, of course, is that Jesus has come and has built his church, but what have we seen over the centuries? I've only got a summary here of what we've seen over the centuries. Instead of walking in the ancient paths, what happened? Well, Jesus came and built his church about AD 30, that's great. But even in the early 50s, AD 50s, Galatia and Corinth started to go off the track and had to be corrected by Paul. Then in the 60s, Pergamum and Thyatira had to be corrected by John in the book of Revelation. And then after that, we have recorded in history all of these different sects and denominations, splittings up that came from the truth. And so we have things like the Catholics starting to form about the 300s, Roman Catholics 1054, Lutherans 1526, Church of England, and so on and so on and so on. And we see all of these different denominations, all of these different churches, Baptists 1609, Methodists 1739 and so on. All of these creeping in over the years. And what have people forgotten with all of these groups? Well, they've forgotten the principle, you see, that we need to ask for and walk in the ancient paths. We don't decide today what we're going to do. We don't even look back into history and say, oh, well, look, let's get back to what the Lutherans were doing in 1526. That's not asking for the ancient paths. Asking for the ancient paths and walking in them is to go back to the first century, to the law of Christ, and walk in that law of Christ. And again, if you think about it, some people are saying today, well, look, if we go back, that's about 2,000 years ago. Surely that's out of date, isn't it? We need to change things. We need to jazz it up a bit and make it relevant for today. But I would suggest to you that if we go back and think about the good kings and the good prophets of God, did they say the law of Moses was getting too old? We need to jazz it up a bit and change it? Plenty of people in their day were saying that, but they didn't say that, did they? They said, go back, ask for the ancient paths and walk in them. And that's what we've got to do today. We've got to go from 2024 back to the first century, to the teaching of Christ and his apostles, and make sure we follow that, even though it's 2,000 years old. And I find it very sad today that when you present this message, that you've got many, many thousands of people in the world that belong to many of these groups. And they're exactly like the people of Jeremiah's day. Because when you tell them about the ancient paths and they need to walk in it, what do they say? We will not walk in it. Very, very sad indeed. Just as it was sad in the time of Jeremiah that the people refused to walk in that path. Just as it was sad in the time of Jesus. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 23 how he wanted to gather together the people of Jerusalem as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and they were unwilling. and he said, your house is left to you desolate. You see, God extends the invitation to all, but he expects all of us to come back to him and to ask for the ancient paths and to walk in them. And so I thought I'd get a bit more specific this morning. We don't have a lot of time, but what are some of the ways in which people have left the ancient paths today? Well, let's have a quick look through here. We're not going to dwell at any great length on these, but the beginning of the church that Jesus built took place, Acts 11 verse 15, at Jerusalem in AD 30 approximately, Acts chapter 2. What do we find today? Various groups starting at different times. That's not the ancient path, you see. The ancient path goes back to Jerusalem, AD 30. The head of the church, the apostles taught that Christ was the head of the church, Ephesians 5:23. Today we have popes, we have all kinds of earthly headquarters for supposed churches, not what we find in the ancient paths. Let's keep going. How is the church described in the scriptures? The churches of Christ, the church of God, these are all scriptural names. What do we find today? Baptist church, Mormon church, Jehovah's Witnesses. Where do you find that in the ancient paths? You don't find any of those names in the ancient paths. You see, we've got to leave these things and go back to the ancient paths and walk in them. The doctrine, we're supposed to be abiding in the doctrine of Christ today. Not going back to Moses, as we saw, the law's changed. But what do we find today? People substituting human creeds, traditions of men, following what they want to follow without going back to the ancient paths of the teachings of Christ. Entrance into the church. We're told in 1 Corinthians 12:13, we're all baptised into one body. What do we find today? People saying we can be saved by faith alone, just by saying the sinner's prayer and so on. This is not the ancient path. We need to go back and ask for those ancient paths and walk in them. The disciples were called Christians in Antioch. What do we find today? People calling themselves Lutherans after Martin Luther, or Mennonites after Menno Simons and so on. I haven't got enough room to put many of these in, but you get the idea. This is not the ancient path. The ancient path is recorded for us in our New Testaments. Titles today, Jesus said, don't call any man on earth your father, your spiritual father. And yet what do we find today? We've got the Pope, Old English Papa, fathers, reverends and so on. Again, this column here is not the ancient way. We've got to ask for the ancient way and go back and walk in it. A few more of these. Organisation of Jesus' church under the New Testament. Notice that the Philippians 1 verse 1, you had saints, Christians and overseers and deacons formed the organisation of the church. Today we find cardinals and archbishops and councils and synods and so on. Not the ancient way. We need to ask for the ancient way and get back to it. Assembling together as the church, we find they came together to break bread. They took up the collection. They were singing from their heart. All of the things that we've done this morning. That's the ancient way in the scriptures. What do we find today? People having the Lord's Supper annually instead of on the first day of the week. Or having it on Saturdays instead of the first day of the week. Or the collections not used for the saints as Paul directed in 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 and 2. Or there's fetes and bazaars and fairs for raising of money instead of taking up the collection. And when we go down to singing, what do we find today? Instead of singing and making melody with your heart, we find people singing and making melody with musical instruments and organs and bands and so on. These, you see, are all innovations added later. We need to go back and ask for the ancient ways, the ancient paths, and walk in them. Speaking in the church. The women are to keep silent. 1 Corinthians 14 verse 34. What do we find today? Women preachers, women leaders, women pastors, you name it. You can just about find anything today. Not the ancient path. We need to go back and ask for that ancient path. Sin is not tolerated in Jesus' church. In 1 Corinthians 5 verse 13, the wicked man had to be removed if he didn't repent of his sin. Today we find homosexual leaders in various denominations and so on. I won't labour the point anymore. But I'm hoping you're seeing today that all of us are at the crossroads. All of us each day and every day, have got to make a decision. Are we going to stand? Are we going to stop and think about which way we're going? Are we going to ask for the ancient paths? In the times of the prophets and the kings, that was the law of Moses. In our time, it's the law of Christ. Are we going to ask for the ancient paths? And more importantly, are we going to walk in it? Are we going to do it and follow those ancient paths? You know, the church that Jesus built is throughout the world today. We know that from various scriptures. And if where you are meeting doesn't follow the ancient paths that we've just been talking about, then it's very easy for you to get out your Bible and find like-minded people and to start following the Bible and the ancient paths and establish the church in the place where you are. You see, the important thing this morning is that we should all be asking for the ancient paths so that we might walk in them. And so let's go back to where we started this morning. The people in Jeremiah's day were in a dire situation. And God himself, thus says the Lord, gives this sublime solution to the problem. All they had to do, it was really rather simple. All they had to do was go back and ask for the ancient paths and walk in them. And for us today, the message is no different. We've seen in 2 John 9 that if anyone goes too far and doesn't abide in the doctrine of Christ, he does not have God. For us today, the principle is the same. We need to go back and ask for the ancient paths. The New Testament law is delivered by Christ through his apostles and prophets of the New Testament. We need to go back and follow that. The question we've all got to ask, of course, is are we going to take advantage of it? The people in Jeremiah's day very sadly said no, we're not going to walk in those ways. We're not going back to those ways. And today, of course, very sadly, there are many people who refuse to go back to AD 30, to the church that Jesus built, and become a part of that church. They'd much rather stay in their various groups and divisions. Well, let's not be like them. Let's not say we will not walk in it. Let's teach and let's walk in the ancient paths that have been delivered to us. I'd like us to finish this morning by going across to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. I don't know if you picked it up in this passage that I put up from Jeremiah chapter 6, but the promise was given to the people that if you do ask for the ancient paths and if you do walk in them, then you'll find rest. That's the true way to finding rest. And the passage I'd like to finish with in Matthew 11 is a bit similar, because Jesus extends the invitation to us all to find rest as well. Spiritual rest, forgiveness of sins, salvation. Notice Matthew 11 verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light. Twice he mentions rest there. He offers rest for people that will come to him. But notice what he also says. We've got to take his yoke upon us and learn from him. We've got to go back, you see. We've got to go back to the ancient paths that tell us about Jesus, that give us the teachings of Jesus through his apostles and prophets. We've got to learn from him, take his yoke upon us, and he will give us rest. We extend that invitation this morning to all who are here or listening. Become a Christian, a follower of Christ, by believing and repenting and being baptised, Acts 2:38. As Christians, remain faithful to Christ by following this same principle, asking for the ancient paths and walking in them. Going back, you see, to the teachings of Christ as delivered to us in the New Testament by his chosen apostles and prophets, and following that teaching. That's the way of rest. That's the way of hope. That's the way of salvation. The lesson this morning has been, ask for the ancient paths and walk in them. Let's make sure we take that to heart. Let's now ask Carl to lead us in the last song.